A twig snaps in the dark, and 40 pairs of ears turn toward the sound. Nobody moves. Nobody breathes. 90,000 years before anyone invents a word for panic, a family is deciding, without speaking a single word, whether this is the night they die. It doesn't happen on a hunt. It doesn't happen in daylight, when danger can be seen and measured. It happens after the sun disappears, when the whole world turns into sound and guesswork. For most of human history, night was not rest. Night was the test nobody could skip. So what did they actually do in those long hours between one sunset and the next sunrise? Not the movie version with torches and screaming. The real version. The fires, the whispered plans, the arguments, the lullabies, the fear. And somehow, tangled up in the middle of all of it, the birth of almost everything we now call human. The light changes first. Long before the sun touches the horizon, the color of the world shifts, from bright gold to a heavy, deep orange. Everyone in camp feels it in their stomach before they notice it in the sky. Work speeds up. Nobody says the word hurry, but everybody starts moving like it was shouted. There is a simple reason for the rush. Human eyes are built for daylight. They are packed with cells that catch color and sharp detail in bright light, but very few of the cells that let cats, owls, and wolves see clearly in near darkness. We also lack a mirror-like layer behind the eye, the thing that makes a cat's eyes flash in headlights. When the sun goes down, we go half blind, and almost everything hunting us does not. That one blunt fact explains almost everything about how a prehistoric night unfolded. Every choice, from where to sleep to who stays awake, traces back to it. At night, we are not the strongest animal in the story. For a few hours, we are one of the most vulnerable ones on the entire landscape. With eyesight failing, the other senses had to work overtime. Ears strained for footsteps in the grass, for the difference between wind moving a branch and something heavier moving it on purpose. Noses caught the drift of smoke, and beneath it, sometimes something else. In the dark, the whole camp became one shared sensor, each person catching whatever their ears or nose could find. The camp itself was never chosen by accident. Long before sunset, someone had already picked the spot. High enough to see danger coming. Close enough to water to avoid a trip in the dark. A bad camp choice at noon could turn into a deadly mistake by midnight, and everyone who lived long enough to have children had learned that lesson early. Some of the oldest proof of this planning comes from a place called Ohelo, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. There, archaeologists found the remains of a small brushwood hut, more than 23,000 years old, with a fire pit just outside the door. Someone built walls. Someone faced the doorway away from the wind. Someone, in other words, was already thinking like a builder, long before anyone had a word for it. Firewood was gathered in a hurry. And never just once. A fire that dies at midnight is worse than no fire at all. Because now, every animal nearby knows exactly where the blind, frightened humans are sleeping. Arms fill with branches again and again, stacked close enough to reach without leaving the light. Because stepping outside that circle of firelight after dark was never a small decision. Here is the strange comfort hiding inside all that fear. Fire is one of the only things on Earth that nearly every large predator avoids. Lions, wolves, hyenas. Animals that could kill a human in seconds will not casually walk through open flame. That fear isn't learned. It's built in. Which means a ring of firelight wasn't just warmth. It was the first wall humans ever had, made from nothing but light. And that wall did something to the humans behind it, too. Fire pushed back the cold, dried, wet skin and turned raw, tough food into something soft and safe to eat. The scientist Richard Wrangham has argued that cooking may be one of the most important things our ancestors ever learned. Because heat does part of digestion before food even reaches the mouth, unlocking far more energy from every bite. And more energy meant they could afford the most expensive thing they owned. A large, hungry, curious brain. That brain is why the same fire that kept the body alive also slowly changed the mind. A creature safe enough to stop panicking for a few hours, warm enough to sit still, and fed enough to have energy to spare, is a creature with something rare on its hands. Free time. In the dark. And what humans did with that free time is where this story stops being about survival and starts being about who we became. As the last light fades, the land beyond camp changes shift. The daytime animals go quiet. A different set of eyes opens instead. Leopards, striped hyenas, and in some ancient places, cave lions and bears far larger than anything alive today. They aren't villains. They are simply doing what predators have always done. Hunting when their eyes work best. And ours barely work at all. That danger left marks that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. At a South African site called Swartkrans, scientists found ancient skulls with two round holes, spaced exactly like the lower fangs of a leopard. A leopard that likely dragged its meal up into a tree, the way leopards still do today. For a long stretch of our history, we were not always the ones hunting after dark. Sometimes, we were the meal. There is even a famous ancient child, known as the Taung child. Its fossil skull shows damage that researchers match to the grip of a large bird of prey. Talon marks and scoring almost identical to what eagles leave on monkeys they kill. It's a small, haunting reminder. Sometimes the danger didn't come from the grass. Sometimes it came from the sky, and it came for the smallest ones first. Knowing all this, the fear that pulled a family close to the fire starts to look less like weakness, and a lot more like wisdom. Every instinct that made an ancient human nervous after dark, the flinching, the listening, the refusal to wander off alone, was a small survival advantage. Passed down quietly because the humans who didn't feel that fear tended not to become anyone's ancestors. Somewhere in camp, a voice calls out for the children, sharper than it needed to be an hour ago. Kids who were chasing each other near the tall grass come running back toward the light without being told twice. Not because they understand how predators hunt, but because the fear in that voice needs no translation. Some warnings are older than language itself. Notice who is doing the calling. It is rarely just one parent. Among hunter-gatherer groups studied today, a single baby might be held, soothed, or watched by many different people in one evening. Aunts, uncles, grandparents, older cousins, neighbors with no blood tie at all. At night, a child was never really the job of only two people. A whole circle of adults quietly kept watch, in shifts nobody had to arrange. Dinner isn't only about hunger. It is the last big task before the real waiting begins. Meat goes onto the coals. Roots are pushed into the ash to soften. And the smell of cooking drifts far out into the dark, well beyond the edge of the firelight, which is its own kind of risk. Advertising exactly where the food and the people eating it can be found. But sharing that meal is doing something bigger than filling stomachs. Eating together, at the same fire, at the same time, is one of the oldest bonding habits our species has. It says, without a single word, that everyone in this circle belongs to everyone else. In a world with no locks and no walls, belonging wasn't just a nice feeling. It was a survival strategy, and the sharing followed rules that were surprisingly strict. In hunter-gatherer camps studied today, a successful hunter often doesn't keep the best of the kill or even hand it out himself. The meat is divided by others, spread through the whole group. It sounds unfair, but it's clever. When you share your luck today, you are buying insurance for the day your own hunt fails. Around that ancient fire, generosity wasn't only kindness. It was the closest thing to a savings account anyone had. Keeping that fire alive through a whole night is real work, and it never fully stops. Someone has to feed it branches every hour, all night, every night, for their entire life. Archaeologists have traced this exact habit back roughly 1 million years to burnt bone and ash found deep inside Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. Proof that long before our species even existed, an earlier ancestor had already learned this endless, thankless chore. That job never had a name, but it may be one of the most important jobs in our whole history. Let the fire die at 3 in the morning, and everyone sleeping around it wakes in total darkness. Blind, confused, suddenly exposed. The person quietly feeding branches into the coals, while everyone else dreams, was holding the whole camp's survival in their hands. Once the food is gone and the children grow drowsy, the talk around the fire changes shape. Researchers who recorded real campfire talk among one group in the Kalahari noticed something surprising. Daytime talk is full of complaints, small arguments, who did what. But nighttime talk, by firelight, turns almost entirely toward stories. Ancestors, legends, distant relatives, jokes. The fire doesn't just light the camp. It seems to flip a switch in what people are willing to say. Some researchers, including the anthropologist Robin Dunbar, believe language itself may have partly grown to do what grooming does for chimpanzees, building trust and friendship, only for far more people at once than anyone could ever groom by hand. If that's true, then these firelit nights, hour after hour, may have been one of the most important classrooms language ever had. Think about what fire really brought them here. For every other animal on the planet, the day simply ends when the sun goes down. But fire handed our ancestors something no creature ever had before. Extra hours. 2, 3, sometimes 4 more waking hours, stolen back from the dark, night after night, for thousands of generations. Add all those hours together, and you are looking at an ocean of extra time. Time spent not hunting or fleeing, but talking, teaching, imagining, and bonding. Those weren't wasted hours, and they weren't ordinary ones. They may have been the most important hours our species ever invented, because they were spent doing the one thing almost no other animal does. Sitting still, safe enough together, thinking about things that weren't happening right in front of them. Not the animal you hunted today, but the one your grandfather hunted and what it taught him. That quiet habit of talking about the past and the future is the root of nearly everything we now call human. Not every hand by the fire is idle. Someone is running a sharp stone across a piece of wood, shaping a spear point by feel almost as much as by sight. Someone else threads animal sinew through a bone needle, mending a torn hide before the cold gets in. Night wasn't dead time. It was workshop time, squeezed out of the only hours when the hunting finally stopped. And this matters more than it sounds. A child sitting nearby, watching an elder's hands work in the firelight for the 100th time, is soaking up a skill that no one ever had to explain in words. Making tools, sewing, tying knots. A huge amount of ancient human knowledge was passed down exactly like this. Quietly at night, through nothing more than watching and copying. Some of those tools were surprisingly advanced. At a cave called Sibudu in South Africa, archaeologists found signs that people were making glue around 70,000 years ago. They heated tree resin and mixed it with other ingredients to fix sharp stone points onto wooden shafts. That may not sound dramatic, but making good glue means controlling heat carefully and planning several steps ahead. The quiet toolmaker by the fire wasn't just shaping stone. They were doing chemistry long before the word existed. Then come the real stories. Not gossip, but the big ones. Why the moon changes shape. Why a certain valley is forbidden. What happened to the man who ignored his elders and wandered too far from the fire. These weren't only entertainment. They were survival manuals, hidden inside adventure, memorized instead of written down. Because writing wouldn't exist for tens of thousands more years. It sounds almost too good to be true, but some of these stories genuinely survived. Researchers have found stories, passed down by word of mouth in Australia, that describe coastlines from more than 7,000 years ago. Coastlines that were later swallowed by rising seas and only confirmed by modern science. A story told carefully around enough fires, for enough generations, can outlast the very land it describes. Eventually, faces tilt upward. With no city glow to compete with, the ancient night sky wasn't just visible. It was overwhelming. A thick river of stars, stretching from one edge of the world to the other. More stars than most people alive today have ever seen at once. For nearly all of human history, this wasn't a rare, special view. It was simply what the sky always looked like. And that sky wasn't only beautiful. It was useful. Fixed stars and familiar patterns gave travelers a compass that never needed batteries and never clouded over for long. Many hunter-gatherer peoples still use the stars to find direction, mark the seasons, and time long journeys across empty land. A skill almost certainly inherited from ancestors who had no other guide. Some of our ancestors may have gone even further and tracked the sky itself. A carved bone from France, around 32,000 years old, holds a winding row of marks. One researcher argued they match the changing phases of the moon almost exactly. If he is right, then someone sat by a fire like this one, night after night, quietly cutting a bone. Building one scratch at a time, one of the earliest calendars our species ever made. And reading the moon was more than curiosity. It was planning. A full moon meant a night bright enough to travel, to hunt, or to move camp under a silver light. A new moon meant near total blackness. The most dangerous nights of the month, best spent close to the fire and nowhere else. People who could look at the moon and predict, days ahead, how much light a night would bring, could plan their whole month around it. The sky wasn't decoration. It was the oldest schedule humanity ever kept. There is something almost unbearably human in all of this. A small, half-blind, easily frightened animal, sitting in the dark at the bottom of the food chain, looked up at the one thing it could never reach. And instead of only fearing it, began to study it, to count it, to tell stories about it. The same creature that flinched at every snapping twig somehow found the nerve to turn the terrifying dark overhead into a map, a clock, and a calendar. And they weren't sleeping on bare ground either, at least not everywhere. Back at that same cave, Sibudu, archaeologists uncovered bedding made from layered plants, roughly 77,000 years old. Some of the oldest bedding ever found. Stranger still, the top layer was often a leafy plant that naturally keeps insects away. And the old bedding shows signs of being burned and replaced. Long before bug spray, someone had already worked out which leaves keep the mosquitoes off, and that a quick fire clears out the fleas. Eventually, bodies begin to settle low onto that bedding, and the arrangement is never random. People sleep pressed close together, not only for comfort, but for heat. A huddled group loses far less warmth overnight than anyone sleeping alone. In colder places and colder times, sleeping apart from the group wasn't just lonely. It could be genuinely dangerous. And sleep itself looked nothing like a modern 8-hour block. A study that placed sleep trackers on hunter-gatherer groups found people drifting off slowly after dark, waking briefly through the night and rising before sunrise. With no alarm clock, and no one ever counting or even caring how many hours it added up to. There was no such thing as enough sleep. There was only rested enough to function. Here is the detail that should genuinely surprise you. When one researcher tracked the sleep of a camp in Tanzania for 20 nights, he found the whole group asleep at the exact same moment for a total of just 18 minutes. Across the entire study, the rest of the time, someone was always at least a little awake. No guard was ever chosen. It simply happened. Because different people naturally get sleepy and wake up at different times. In other words, evolution may have built a night watch without ever designing one, using nothing more than the ordinary difference between early risers and night owls. The relative you always complain about, the one who wakes far too early or stays up far too late. For a few 100,000 years, that exact habit may be the reason nobody in the group got dragged off in their sleep. The elders often had the lightest sleep of all, waking again and again through the night, dozing in short pieces rather than one long stretch. Today, we might call that a problem. Back then, it may have been a gift. An old woman stirring at the smallest sound, awake at an hour when everyone younger had finally drifted off, was a guardian nobody had to appoint. In a world without clocks or guards, the oldest, lightest sleepers were often the group's best protection. Then, without warning, a sound cuts through the dark. A snapped branch. A low grunt. A rustle in the grass that shouldn't be moving on its own. In an instant, the whole body reacts before the mind even catches up. Heart slamming. Breath caught. Every muscle ready to run or fight. All from a flood of adrenaline that has barely changed in 100,000 years. Most of the time, it's nothing. Wind. A small animal. A branch settling as it cools. But most of the time is not the same as always. And every person around that fire grew up hearing what happens to the camp that assumes it's always nothing. So they wait. They listen. And only when the silence stretches long enough do their shoulders slowly drop back down. That jolt of fear was never really a flaw. The pounding heart, the caught breath, the sudden readiness to run, all came from a burst of adrenaline that prepared the body to survive the next few seconds. The families who felt that fear most sharply were often the ones who lived to pass it on. Which means every anxious, over-alert moment you have ever had in the dark is a signature left by ancestors who survived because they never learned to fully relax. Even when sleep finally comes, the mind does not switch off. It goes somewhere strange instead. Dreaming is one of the oldest and weirdest habits of the human brain, and it almost certainly did not skip a single one of these ancient nights. One idea, called the threat simulation theory, suggests that dreams grew as a kind of practice run. A safe, sleeping rehearsal space. Here, the brain replays danger, chasing, hiding, and fighting over and over with no real risk. Studies even show that children growing up in truly dangerous places have more threatening dreams than children in safer ones, as if the brain quietly adjusts its training to match the world outside. To ancient people, of course, none of this had a scientific name. A vivid dream about a dead relative or a warning from an animal spirit could carry enormous weight. Sometimes it was read by an elder as a real message, worth changing plans over. Whether or not the spirits were real, the dreams were doing something useful anyway, quietly rehearsing the mind for whatever the world might bring next. Long before the sky actually brightens, the body begins to wake on its own. A hormone starts rising in the last stretch before dawn, preparing the body for alertness, before there is even a reason to open your eyes. This isn't a modern quirk. It's an ancient inner alarm clock, tuned over hundreds of thousands of years to have you ready and awake, just as the most dangerous, darkest hours are about to end. The first sound of morning usually isn't human. It's birdsong rising in that strange, layered chorus that comes right before the sun appears, as if the whole world is clearing its throat before the day officially begins. One by one, the humans around the fire begin to stir too, stiff and tired, and every single morning, quietly, enormously relieved. And then, finally, the sun clears the horizon, and the whole camp changes color again, gold and orange, flooding back over a world that, only hours earlier, had shrunk down to nothing but a small circle of firelight and fear. Nobody says, "We made it." Nobody needs to. Everyone standing there already knows, in some wordless way older than language, that a quiet miracle just happened again. This wasn't a single dramatic night from some old legend. This was every night. Thousands of them. Then tens of thousands. Each one a small, unremarkable victory against darkness, cold, hunger, and animals, built to hunt exactly what humans were built to fear. Nobody wrote it down as an achievement because nobody saw it as one. It was simply another night. And then another. And somehow, that quiet repetition built the very species capable of asking how it happened. You still carry pieces of that night inside you. The part of your mind that flinches at a strange noise in an empty house after midnight. The comfort you feel gathered around any kind of light, with people you trust, telling stories that have nothing urgent about them at all. The particular relief of watching a dark sky slowly turn to morning. None of that is random. It's inheritance. So somewhere, right now, a version of that same twig is still snapping in the dark. In someone's mind, if nowhere else. And a very old, very deep part of every one of us still turns toward the sound. And waits. The exact same way it did, on a night none of us remember. But every one of us survived.